All right, tonight we're going to be talking about the rise of Islam and its effect upon the church. In fact, there's four different parts of this lecture that I want you to notice. We're going to talk about the beginnings of Islam, of course, where it started. Then we're going to talk about the rise of Islam in terms of how it moved from Muhammad out into becoming a major world religion. And then we'll move to some of the beliefs of Islam, because I think it's appropriate, if we're going to talk about Islam, to actually understand what Islam teaches. And then we'll talk about some of the effects of Islam on the church during the Middle Ages. There's been effects, of course, on the church since Islam started, obviously, even to today. But we're dealing specifically with the church in the Middle Ages. All right, so we're dealing with that church that starts, you remember, in the late part of the 5th century, at the fall of the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire, and continues on until the Reformation. So at this point, the church in the West has brought order. It's converted the barbarians from the north to Nicene Orthodoxy. It's established itself as, or it's beginning to establish itself as, a political force in the Western world. The Eastern Church is still continuing on. As we looked at last week, it dealt with a number of Christological issues related to the nature of Christ in terms of his nature as both the Son of God and the Son of Man, and brought together a number of ecumenical councils to resolve those issues. And the divide between the East and the West slowly continues through time. Okay? So now we're going to introduce into that a new threat to Christianity that's coming from the Arabian Peninsula. The 7th century then, if we get early in the 7th century, okay, so we're talking about the early 600s, we see at this particular point a number of things on the western side. The Arian invaders from the north, as I mentioned a moment ago, have been assimilated into Nicene Orthodoxy. The Franks and the Gauls are united as new believers. The British Isles, up in the British Isles, including the main British Isle along with Ireland and Scotland, you see a great conversion to Christianity, a number of missionaries that were sent there, and so you see a continuing sense of Christianity in that place. And the Byzantine Empire, which we established in Constantinople, continues to enjoy its peace, particularly in its North African rim. Okay, now don't forget that you see the Eastern Empire as a reverse C coming from Constantinople down through Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and around into northern Africa. Okay, so you have this wing over here, which is the east, and the west, of course, is everything to the west in Europe. Which leads us, of course, to the man at the forefront of this reality, a man by the name of Muhammad. Muhammad was born in Mecca in 570 A.D., but he was orphaned at an early age and raised by an uncle. In fact, I think it was a maternal uncle. I have to confirm that, but I believe it was. He was a merchant by trade in that particular time and was married, first married at the age of 25. So he was married at your typical age in that particular time frame. Now, Muhammad seemed to have deep religious interests. He was fascinated by things religious, especially where they intersected with Judaism and Christianity. Now, let's pause for a moment. Christianity, of course, is spread out across the eastern half of the empire. And you remember a few lessons ago we talked about some of the places that Christianity went to, one of them being into the Arabian Peninsula. So missionaries went out to that particular place and brought Christianity. Judaism itself had spread as well. After 70 A.D., the Jews were scattered out of Palestine and spread to the four corners of the earth. And so there were a great number of Jews that settled in all sorts of places. So Muhammad had contact with Jews and Christians in Mecca. Unfortunately, the form of Christianity that he was introduced to was a more an Arian form of Christianity. It was also not well developed in that place. You send missionaries to a place, unless you've had an opportunity to really disciple the people that are there after those missionaries come in, you wind up at times with various syncretistic forms of Christianity and so forth. So this is what Muhammad encountered. He encountered this form of Christianity, this very early form of Christianity, as well as Judaism. He was discontent with his life, and he took some inspiration from both Christians and Jews of the time and withdrew from Mecca, went to a cave to live and just do meditation, very much like the monks of the Christian era. So he kind of got a little bit of that from Christianity, a little bit of that also from Judaism, and he brought that into his life. It was during this time, when he was away in these meditations, at roughly the age of 40, during what we now consider the month of Ramadan, okay, he began to have, or he claimed to have, a series of visions, revelations from God. And he began to write them down. He wrote down these various revelations from a God that he named Allah. He did not recognize this God to be the God of the Christians or necessarily the God of the Jews, although he understood potentially that this God could in fact be the God of the Christians and the God of the Jews. It's not necessarily the way it was presented by Christians and or Jews. About 3 years later then, he went public with these various revelations. And he began to be, if you will, a prophet in that place. He thought of these revelations as being the kind of thing that needed to be spoken of out in public. And so he began to speak of them. And one of the things that he began to teach is this idea that God is one. And one of the central tenets of Islam is the idea that God is one. He was fiercely monotheistic. He believed that God could only be one God. Now, let's be clear where he's making his contradistinction here. The Christians, of course, are claiming the triune God. And you remember the Arian form of Christianity separated or made a distinction between the Father and the Son, and thus by definition and extension, the Spirit as well. And so if it's not taught precisely, the natural impression that one would get, especially if one is not a convert, is that the Christians were actually worshiping three different gods. One named the Father, one named Jesus, one named the Spirit. And so Muhammad saw this as inconsistent with his revelations that he had received, that God is one. And so he began to preach this idea that God is one. And he preached this idea that coming to God requires absolute surrender. Now, again, he is picking up some of that from the Christian religion and even from Judaism, because Judaism, as you know, would be a strongly traditional religion where if you converted to Judaism, you're submitting yourself completely to that religious and ethnic system. So he picked up some of that, we think, from that territory. So he had this idea that to come to these understandings of God as he had received them in the revelation, you needed to fully submit yourself to this God that he was attempting to reveal, that had been revealed to him. And this is where the name Islam comes from. Islam means surrender in the Arabic. So the concept of surrender is fundamental. You cannot come to God without fully surrendering yourself to him. He also proclaimed that he was a prophet and messenger of God along the lines of the great prophets of the past, going all the way back to Adam and Noah and Abraham, Moses, the main prophets of Judaism, as well as even Jesus himself. He understood Jesus through these revelations to be nothing more than a prophet. Now, an exalted prophet, no doubt, one of the chief prophets of all those that God has sent. But he did not perceive him as divine. He certainly did not perceive him in the Christian sense that the various ecumenical councils were attempting to deal with at the very time that this is occurring, that Jesus is fully the Son of God and the Son of Man simultaneously. Now, in Mecca, Muhammad was not well received as a prophet. His initial attempts to proselytize the people to his revelations were not well met. The locals did not receive him well. In fact, he was treated with a great deal of hostility, even from the local authorities, who did not see him as the kind of man that he was. Again, you've probably got to figure out at this point that in the Arabian Peninsula, Christianity has probably had enough of an effect upon the area that all of the society is relatively stable. I mean, it's under the auspices of the Eastern Empire at this point. And so there's stability there. So when you have a new prophet come to town who's starting to preach something totally unique from everything else, you're probably going to get this kind of backlash to begin with. I give you the Apostle Paul's Exhibit A in many of the places that he went to. He was not well received, particularly by the local authorities. Same is true here. So to escape from persecution, he fled to Medina in 622. Muslims call this the Hijrah, the beginning of the Islamic calendar, when he made his journey to Medina. And it was there that Muhammad established the first Islamic community. Again, notice the parallels to the monastic movement. He builds his own little community and establishes his own little rule in that place, very much like the Benedictine rule that we talked about before, but in this case built upon the revelations of Allah that he had received. In Medina, he managed to unite several conflicting tribes, Arabian peoples living in the area, and warred against Mecca for 8 years, using guerrilla tactics mostly, into the city. And he and his followers managed to conquer the city of Mecca in 630. But he died just 2 years later, in 632. By then, he had managed to convert most of the Arabian Peninsula to Islam. He had succeeded in converting most of the population in the peninsula, and he had managed to unite most of the Arabian tribes under a single Muslim polity, or a single Muslim law, okay? So, Islam is native to Saudi Arabia, okay? It's where it comes from. It's where he was, and it's where it comes from, and the holy city of Mecca is there. Also, Medina is considered a holy city as well, because that is Muhammad's hometown. Now, after Muhammad dies then, obviously he does not have an opportunity, because he only survives 2 years after conquering Mecca. He is not able to fan Islam out beyond the reaches of the Arabian Peninsula, okay? So after he dies, leadership passes to a series of men who are known as caliphs, C-A-L-I-P-H-S, caliphs. That word in Arabic means successor. Yes, that's correct. Under a leader, a caliphate, right. It was under these men that the Arabians began to move out in conquest, okay? They saw the religion as a religion of conquest. They saw it as one to move out and take Sharia law that had been revealed to Muhammad and bring it out into the rest of the world. It's not enough for it to exist just in one place. It must take over the world. That's Muhammad's view, okay? So he sees it as this idea, and the mullahs after him also see it this way. So they began to war against the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Empire. They had their first victory over the Byzantines in 633 under the first caliph by the name of a man by the name of Abu Bakr. They invaded Syria, and they took Damascus in 635 under the second caliph, Omar. In 638, they moved south from Syria into Jerusalem and took it in 638. And by 640, just 2 years later, they controlled all of the Holy Land, all of Palestine. So they made an arc out of Saudi Arabia, came through and came down into Palestine. They continued on their southward journey into Egypt and overtook Alexandria in 642, just 2 years after that, establishing in Egypt the city of Cairo. They continued along the northern coast of Africa, moving west, as you know, across the lower sea under the Mediterranean, between 644 and 656, under the third caliph, a man by the name of Uthman. And then they overran the Persian Empire to their east in 651. So you will notice that Muhammad's death in 632, it is 20 years later that they have conquered all of the territories around the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. In just 20 years, they move out. Okay? Now, Islam itself is, of course, based on the revelations of Muhammad that he received and written, of course, in the Quran. Islam, however, constantly struggled for power. The various different people groups inside of Islam continued to struggle internally for power and control of Islam. The Arabian people are known for this. I don't mean to be racist. It just is how they are. They are a factious people. You will notice Muhammad himself had to bring together a number of warring tribes in order to be able to take over Mecca. So you have various people groups all over the Arabian Peninsula. They're very much like the ancient Jews that were Semites. They lived in their little tent cities and their little towns and so forth. And so they were at constant war with each other. Well, that struggle continues, okay? Because, well, we don't like those people over there. Now, we're united in a faith, but we still despise each other, okay? And so this struggle continues. Of the first four caliphs that I mentioned, Abu Bakr, Omar, and Uthman, they three were assassinated. The fourth, Caliph number 4, was a man by the name of Ali. He was Muhammad's cousin. He ruled from 656 to 661. He, during his struggle, is what ultimately ignited the Sunni Shiite division of Islam. So you will see it's been 1,400 years that this has been going on. So any American president that tells you he's going to be able to go over and solve the Sunni Shia conflict in the Middle East is full of it up to here, because that's been going on for way too long to solve by diplomacy. The Shiites supported Ali. The Sunnis supported his rivals. It was not a religious difference, it was a political difference. Shiites insist that only a descendant of Muhammad can be a caliph. So only Ali could be a caliph, okay? The Sunnis, however, insist that any descendant of the first four caliphs can rule. So they offer a wider plan of succession, okay? So now, much of that distinction has been lost since those days, although I still think that if you ask the typical Sunni Muslim who can be caliph, they would say, well, only someone coming from the line of, the Shiite Muslim could say only from the line of Muhammad. Okay. This internal strife, however, would not dim the conquest of the Arabians. They continued to move out. Carthage, along the northern shore of North Africa, fell in 695, and about 711, a small group of them crossed into Spain and overran the Visigoths there in Spain. They were, however, turned back, finally, as they continued this journey. Okay, so out of Arabia, down through Palestine, across the northern shore of Africa, north into Spain, and then up towards France. Well, it's where they get stopped, finally. It was in France. And they were defeated at the Battle of Tours in North France by Charles Martel in 732. Many would suggest that it is this battle in 732 that kept Europe Christian. That's disputed by some, but it's reasonable to assume that if, in fact, the Muslims had won that battle, it's very possible they could have poured into Europe and made Europe a Muslim area at that point. So at this point, Persia to the east, Syria, Palestine, northern Egypt, North Africa, and Spain are all in Muslim hands at this point. So we're talking about the middle of the 8th century at this point, roughly 711 and later is where we're at. So why were the Muslims so successful in such a short period of time? Well, number one, they had strong armies. Okay, that makes sense. They had strong armies. And because of the chaos that occurred in the fall of the western side of the empire, they found themselves easily able to overcome what was left behind. Okay? We have not yet seen a Holy Roman Empire arise yet. We're still in that phase, as I said, where the Western Church is trying to unify and solidify Europe and what's left of the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire. And so they're They don't really have standing armies at this point. They're just a bunch of people fanned out in all different kinds of places. And you remember I said some time ago that many of these peoples also had conflict with each other about the various places. The Goths and the Visigoths and the Franks and the Gauls, all these various groups were all attacking one another as well, trying to gain a foothold in what was left of the Western Empire. Well, guess what? The Arabians took advantage of all that chaos. They came at a perfect time when there was no Western Empire yet. The Eastern Empire didn't have the strength. It never had the strength, but it didn't have the strength at this time to repel the invaders, particularly into Palestine. They just didn't have a standing set of armies like the Western Empire did at Rome to be able to deal with these. But even that is a bit anachronistic, because you remember that the Western Roman Empire was at its peak much, much earlier. I mean, you go back into the 300s. We're now 300 years later than that, 400 years later than that at this point. Those armies are gone. The legions of the Western Roman Empire are gone. So there's wide open fields for Islam to move in this direction. Secondly, they had a certain disaffection of those under Byzantine and Persian influence. That disaffection helped them. There were certain theological squabbles and the oppression of certain dissident groups like the Monophysites I mentioned last week that aided them. All right, we hate the Byzantines too, so come on in and we'll help you knock them down. So some of the locals were actually helpful in this. And then there were promises made. The Muslims would come to particular areas with their armies and they would threaten those places, but they would make promises. Well, look, we just want to come in and help you, and we're going to establish Sharia law in this place, but you can continue to worship God the way that you want to. So there's promises made, and so there are many who fell into this. In fact, when the Muslims came to Jerusalem, they said to the Jews and Christians that were still in the city that they would be respected in their properties and the customs. Now, they would have to pay tribute. You know, if you're not a Muslim, you pay tribute. There's a name for it, I forget it. But you got to pay tribute, but we'll let you respect your religious traditions. Well, it didn't always quite work out that way. Obviously, right? So, Islam moved effectively as the Arabians took their religion out of the Arabian Peninsula and brought it out and began moving out into the world. And there was really nothing to stop them until they got all the way to Europe. Now, with that in mind then, let's talk a little bit about what Islam actually teaches, okay? Because some of you may not be familiar with the tenets of Islam, and so I decided to stick this in here. It's not really a history class per se, but since we're talking about an entirely different religion, it seems fair to discuss what it's about. Now, the Quran, as I mentioned, is the written recording by Muhammad of the ayah, or what we would say the signs of God that Muhammad heard throughout his life. In fact, the word Quran in Arabic means to recite. In his first vision, Muhammad was told to recite what he heard. So the Quran then is simply a record of his visions down through time. And when I mean down through time, I don't mean over a week. I mean over decades of time. Which is why the Quran is a very inconsistent document from beginning to end. Some of the writings at the beginning of the Quran directly contradict some of the writings at the end of the Quran, which is problematic, of course, for Islamic apologists, having to deal with the fact that their scriptures are not very consistent from beginning to end, okay? So the Quran is this ayah recorded by Muhammad throughout his life. And Islam itself is built on 5 pillars. There's the 5 pillars of Islam, okay? The first is the Shahada, which is a similar word to the word Shema in Judaism. It is a statement of a fundamental belief. Okay, remember the Shema, the Lord is one, the Lord our God is one. It's the idea that there is only one God. His name is Yahweh. Okay. Islam has a similar first pillar, a proclamation of radical monotheism and of accepting Muhammad as Allah's messenger. Okay. The statement is this: there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. That's the Shahada. It's the basic statement of Islam. Every Muslim recites that regularly and consistently during the course of his life. And it is that exact statement that a Muslim will force a Christian to say if that Christian is under persecution by Islam. Because you will notice that it's exactly contradictory to Christianity. So it would push a Christian to have to make a confession of something that he cannot confess, because there isn't only one God. There is the one true God, and his name's not Allah. His name is Yahweh. Okay? Second pillar of Islam is the Salat, the 5 daily prayers. Muslim is required to pray 5 times a day. He is to face towards Mecca, no matter where he is on earth. So sometimes they will face west, sometimes they'll face east, depending upon where they are. And they will say their daily prayers at specific times of the day. If you have ever been in a Muslim majority nation, you will hear the minarets make the cry for or the call to prayer. And you will hear it 5 times a day at really annoying times, too. The other 3 are more general, but they're still pillars. The zakat is a requirement that all Muslims must be almsgivers, okay? They have a personal responsibility based on their ability, designed to aid the poor and distribute some amount of wealth equality. They don't have a direct system of tithe. They're on an honor system, if you will. But they are required to give a portion of their income to the poor. Most Muslims would look at the number right about 2.5% as to what is required. Okay? But they are required to be almsgivers. Again, depending upon ability. Okay? There's no hard and fast rule here then. So the typical Muslim in modern times can make arguments that, well, you know, my expenses are this and this and this, and so I don't have any money to give. And so he could make an argument inside the religious beliefs that, you know, I'm doing the best I can at my paltry little 0.2% or whatever. Okay, but he is under the zakat in that he is required to be an almsgiver. And of course, probably the most recognizable pillar is Ramadan, which of course is a month of the year in which Muslims will fast during the daytime. And of course, this is in honor of the birth of, or I'm sorry, the pilgrimage of Muhammad to, hang on a second, let me make sure I get this right. I always get confused between one and the other. Ramadan is when he has his first revelation. Okay, so he's in the cave. Okay. I always get that confused with another thing. So Ramadan is simply in honor of the fact that Muhammad received these visions. And so for a month, Muslims will fast from sun up to sundown. And this is the holy month of the year. So you've probably heard of Ramadan. And even Western Muslims will do that as well. So the first 4, the first one is a specific one that belongs to the whole life of the Muslim. The Salat then is the process daily that the Muslim is to go through, the prayers. He is to be defined as an almsgiver in pillar number 3, the zakat. He is to celebrate the Ramadan every year. And then there's one final pillar, and that's the Hajj. And that is that every Muslim is required to make, during the course of his lifetime, one pilgrimage to Mecca. He's required to make a pilgrimage. You probably have seen that big black stone at Mecca. You've undoubtedly seen it on TV or in pictures. It's in Saudi Arabia. And you will often see Muslims praying there. Obviously, last year, that all got messed up with coronavirus, but I can assure you they'll be back. You are required, if you are Muslim, to make at least one Hajj in your life to Mecca. No matter what your position or status or financial reality is, you must make that journey at some point during the course of your life. Okay? Now, obviously, Islam and Christianity are very different, as you can probably see. And there's a number of differences that I would point out to you. And probably the biggest one is what distinguishes Islam from Christianity. Okay? Or more specifically, distinguishes the God of Islam from the God of the Bible. and that is the nature of Jesus. Muslims deny the divinity of Jesus, utterly deny the divinity of Jesus. They believe that he was only a prophet, and all of his teachings have been superseded by the teachings of Muhammad. So the Quran takes precedence as scripture over the Christian scriptures. Most Muslims are not aware of the teachings of scripture, of our Bible at all. And in fact, most Muslims have really very little knowledge even of the Quran. They have some, but not much. It's not like our scriptures where we regularly and consistently teach it. That's not how it works in Islam. But that is also what distinguishes the Christian God from Allah, because as Christians, as Orthodox Christians, and more specifically as Chalcedonian Christians, we would argue that the God of the Bible is revealed by virtue of the fact that his Son is divine, making him a part of the Trinitarian nature of God. By the Muslims denying the divinity of Jesus, they are distancing themselves from the God of Scripture, the God of our Bible. Because if somebody says to you, well, Christians and Muslims worship the same God, they're both Abrahamic religions, and we would say, no, no, no. Because the distinction is they will not accept the divinity of Jesus. We believe that the very core of the nature of Yahweh is revealed in the God-man, who made himself the God-man. That's why I say it's a Chalcedonian reality, because remember, at Chalcedon, that's where we have the definition of Jesus as fully God and fully man. The fullness of the nature of God indwelling a man, along with a full human nature within him. And so any Christian who comes along and says, well, you know, we can kind of compromise on that. We'll just call Allah our God and verse. The answer is no, you cannot. Because they would never accept Jesus as being divine. A convert from Islam, technically then, is someone who has embraced the God, Jesus. Who has recognized the godness of Jesus. The God, that Jesus is a member of the Godhead. Okay? That's what a true convert would be. Over the last several decades, there have been some compromise movements trying to evangelize Muslims without pushing them to that. And it is a gross failure because it doesn't actually bring them into Christianity. It leaves them in this quasi-world of thinking that Allah and Yahweh are the same God, denying the substance of what Yahweh has revealed into the world in his Son. Okay? Another contrast is that although Muslims are spoken of as the people of the book in the Quran, meaning the people of the Bible, our Bible, most references to Christians later in the Quran only warn them not to treat Jesus as the Son of God, but simply to just do good to Christians. There's one of those inconsistencies that I talked about. Early in the Quran, Christians are referred to as a people of the book. And they are to be respected as a people of the book. Because early in his revelations, Muhammad saw our scriptures as being a valid source of revelation and inspiration. But by the time you get to the end of the Quran, that's not the case anymore. That's one of the most serious contradictions, and James White exploits it whenever he deals with Muslim apologists in defending Christianity. The resurrection of Jesus, of course, is denied by most Muslims, obviously. Many Muslims don't even think he was crucified. They deny even that he actually hung on a cross. But they do accept his virginal conception and role as a great prophet. Again, he's in the line of the great prophets coming from Adam and Noah and Moses and Abraham and so on. And by the way, as I've mentioned earlier, Islam is considered an Abrahamic faith because it's flowing, quote unquote, from Abraham, in that the people of the Arabian Peninsula find their heritage from Ishmael, the son of Abraham, and so they would consider themselves an Abrahamic people. So this disconnect is that they would see a line of prophets through our Bible, which then ends with Jesus as the greatest of those prophets, and then Muhammad comes as the ultimate and final prophet to follow. Okay? The God of Islam, Allah, is nothing like the God of the Bible. He is impersonal, distant. You do not have a relationship with Allah. You don't hear Muslims speaking of a relationship with God. You don't speak in love terms with God. The concept of our Bible speaking of God loving us and treating us as sons and daughters, that language is not found anywhere in the Quran. And Muslims would consider Allah to be too distant and too holy to be in relationship to human beings. By the way, just as an aside, you would see that coming out of that Platonic thinking, out of Greek philosophy, invading the Christianity and Judaism that went into Arabia. Okay? This idea of a distant God that doesn't have anything to do with us is prominent in deistic circles, which would have been the case in some of those early Platonic Greek movements. So it's possible that Muhammad was influenced by some of those things. So Allah is very different. The idea of mercy is a foreign concept. There is no mercy. You do what you are required to do, and your righteousness is entirely on the basis of your keeping these 5 pillars. Salvation, then, is ultimately a combination of keeping the rule of the Quran and the will of Allah on the Day of Judgment. Thus, the radical concept of martyrdom in Islam. You want to enter paradise having done Allah's work. Now, there's a great deal of controversy, even in Islam, about how this works. There are many moderate Muslims who would argue that martyrdom is a false entry into paradise, and that you do not enter into paradise by killing others and, blowing yourself up with a bomb strapped to your chest. They would argue that there is a sense in which Allah does not accept that as any better of a work than any other work. And of course, then there are the more radicalized groups that would consider that to be the way in which you ultimately wind up going into the very essence of paradise itself. Okay? But fundamentally, for every Muslim, saying the prayers, making the Hajj, giving their alms, being under the so-called will of Quran, which is to do good to others, you're going to make it. You're going to be just fine. There is no concept in Islam of the substitution of one for another, for sin. There's no idea of grace in Islam. It's radical obedience. It's radical obedience. So it is, if you will, a very humanistic religion. Comes that way right out of the beginning. But I would argue that the foundations and the beginnings of Islam find itself in the very same place that everything else does, in the radical, self-centered nature of fallen human beings who make up gods in their own image and worship them and ascribe to them all sorts of requirements that they then impose upon others in order to keep power. I mean, Islam is a perfect picture of the fall of man, in my ever so humble opinion. It works out that way. There's no idea in Islam of grace or mercy. Going to a Muslim and speaking to them of the fact that they are sinful and that they are under the wrath of God, and if they do not convert and turn, repent of their sin and turn to Christ and embrace Him as their sacrifices, is foreign language. It's extremely hard to evangelize Muslims for that very reason. They don't think in those categories. They don't even go there. Frankly, I think it's easier to convert a Catholic than it is a Muslim, because at least you've got some groundwork to start with. Now, what's the effects then of Islam? As you move forward out of these conquests of Arabia, right, the Arabians, okay, so they go out, they begin attacking and moving into all kinds of different places. What kind of effect does this have on the church? All right. Now, what I'm talking about here is by the 8th century. So by the beginning of, say, 700 to 711, right, when the basic conquests of Arabia are done. As I said before, most of the ancient centers of Christianity are now under Muslim rule. Jerusalem, Antioch, Damascus, Alexandria, and Carthage. Those are all the main centers of Christianity coming out of the 1st century and into the imperial church. Okay? I mean, even Carthage, where Augustine was close by, Alexandria, great center of Christianity, now under Muslim control. Now, Christians in these areas were seldom persecuted. as I said earlier, there was always the sense in which Muslims could persecute Christians and would make promises to them that they would keep them safe. But most of the time, the Muslims attempted to move into places and assimilate with the people that were there, bringing with them their Sharia law, reforming, if you will, the political realities of the place, putting the locals under their authority, but also recognizing there's really no point in persecuting the local peoples in their worship of God, because we control them by virtue of our political systems that we've implemented, as well as just the general fact that we're now running the show. And so they didn't really persecute Christians in the area, but because the intention was to convert Christians to Islam, not the other way around, conversions to Christianity by Muslims were strongly punished. Even today, that is true. In many parts of the world today, a person coming out as a Christian from a Muslim world is harshly persecuted, often abandoned by family entirely, and in some places in the world even killed for making such a confession of faith. And on top of that, given the fact that these were Christian centers, particularly Christian centers of learning and apologetics, any defense of Christianity in the place was seen as an offense against Muhammad. So attempting to defend Jesus as the final prophet of God who comes with the very nature of God would, of course, be ultimately offensive against the man who is at the front of Islam, Muhammad. And you see that even to today. You see some of that even to today. Thus, Christianity in most of these areas either disappeared entirely or ceased growing. Many of these parts of the world today have very little, if any, Christian influence at all. Some of it will come back. We'll be talking about Spain being recaptured. We'll talk about some areas like Palestine being recaptured. So there will come back some Christian influence. But if you think about Egypt, Libya, Saudi Arabia, Syria, even Turkey today, are they Christian? No. You think of all those places as Muslim control, don't you? Christianity ceased to exist. In other words, in a sense, what the Arabs did was push Christianity out of Africa into Europe. That's what they did. It was already in Europe, okay, but they pushed out the last remaining influences of Christianity in the lower section of that sea into Europe. Asia Minor, which we call Turkey, continued to remain under Christian influence, being the home of Constantinople for quite some time, but the Turks were eventually able to overrun, the Ottomans were eventually able to overrun the Byzantine Empire in the 1400s. It'll still be another 700 years before that occurs, but you will see the conquest continue in the future. The Byzantine Empire then was pushed back to Asia Minor, as I said, or to its holdings in Europe, because many of its dissenters were now under Muslim rule. The Byzantine Church then, because most of the Muslims, many people were under Muslim control, the Byzantine Church no longer felt the need to take their views into account. So the Monophysites and the Nestorians that we talked about last week, the various branches of thinking related to Jesus' nature, were pretty much ignored by the Byzantine Empire, and they pretty much faded into non-existence. Again, remember, vast majority of Christianity disappeared from this part of the world. So the Monophysites and the Nestorians and so forth that were occupying these territories over generations lost that Christianity and lost that form of Christianity or that understanding of Christ in the process. Christianity began at this time then because of the Muslim invasions. Christianity began to be militarized. Okay, so now we're moving into a time in history when Christians now began to raise up armies themselves. All right, now this dovetails into what we've been talking about the last couple of weeks, right? What happens when the Roman Empire falls? Now you have vacuum. all of these groups come in and begin trying to take over the former territories of the Western Empire. There's chaos everywhere. The church, however, the Western Church, located in Rome, the bishop there in that place, exerts authority to try to bring chaos out of this. And as time goes by, in the attempt to create or to bring order out of this chaos, he begins to develop a political reality to his church. It's no longer just a church. Now it becomes, in many ways, a government that brings order. The bishops, as you remember I said a few weeks ago, began to see themselves less as theologians and spiritual leaders and more of political leaders. Okay, so the church now is moving in the West to becoming an organization that becomes a government. Well, guess what governments do? They make armies. They begin to develop ways of defending themselves. So the earliest Christians, if you go back into the primitive church, right, the original church, the early church, the persecuted church, okay, most of the Christians in those days were pacifists. Some were in the armies, yes, that's true. Some were in the legions. But the vast majority were not. And most Christians in those days considered themselves pacifists. They looked upon the world as though their religion didn't put them in a position of making war against others. Remember, Augustine's just war theory didn't come out. He didn't publish that until the 5th century. This is well after the early church. Okay, so the early church basically thought of itself in very pacifistic terms. When you get into the imperial church then, you start to see the mixture of the church and the state. Now you find Christians who are willing to move into military service, many in the military being converted out of the military into Christianity and still retain their status as a soldier. So Paul could sit next to, for example, that Philippian jailer or the one that he had attached to his ankle in Rome for as long as he did, and preach the gospel to him. And we are told in the scriptures that many in the palace were converted. That there were many in the military who were converted. Well, this would continue. But by the time you get to the military church, you get to a place where it's no longer deemed inappropriate to be a part of the military as a Christian. The early pacifism begins to change into sort of a sense of, yes, I can be a soldier and I can serve an emperor. As a soldier, I worship the living Christ, but I continue to be a soldier. So, and very often during the imperial church, the safety and order of the state would fall to Christians, just by virtue of their numbers, right? So with the invasions from the north by the Germanic peoples, and the invasions from the south by the Muslims, military force seemed to be the only way to stop further loss of territory. I mean, how are you going to prevent? I remember I talked to you a little while ago about a battle that took place in France, in northern France. Well, an army stood up against another army as the Muslims are advancing and drove them back. So the church begins to see itself in a new light on the western side of the empire. It starts to see itself as not only the church, but also the state, which develops an army. Now, you will notice the distinction of that to the East. The East has always had a distinction between the state and the church because there was still an empire there. We still had emperors sitting on thrones in Constantinople and establishing armies. And the church was a group of people doing their worship thing, and the patriarchs and the bishops there never saw themselves as a part of the state. They never saw themselves as needing to be military leaders. They left that to the emperor. But there is no emperor on the western side. And so what you have is, again, how does the vacuum get filled? During this time, and is the Arab invasions in particular, that begin to push the Christian church in the West, what we would today call the Catholic Church, of course, but would push the church in that day to becoming much more militarized. Now seeing themselves as raising up an empire. Christianity then becomes radically militarized during this period of time. It starts off slow, but it becomes radically militarized until you get to the Crusades. The Crusades being the attempt by the militarized church to go back and reclaim Christian territory from the Muslims. Now, we'll come back to the Crusades later. Okay? So, the reason I put this lesson in here, and the reason most historians put this in, is because obviously Islam, just by virtue of becoming a new religion, and as you will notice, a religion that dominates a massive part of the known world at that time, right? I mean, it's taking over literally half of the old Roman Empire, okay? So, it's going to have an obvious effect, spiritually speaking, but because the Arabs were also a conquest people, it's going to naturally then produce a physical side, a military side of the equation as well, as these people are pushing. It's going to affect how the church is going to think, and particularly the church in the West. The Western church is going to be affected by this. Now, again, the Arabs are taking over mostly territories of the East, but it's the West that's most deeply affected by this, spiritually speaking, or in terms of what the church is as an entity. It's now seeing itself moving in this direction. And so there will eventually be a pope who will establish a king in order to establish an actual emperor. And his name is Charlemagne, and he is placed upon the throne on Christmas Day 800. Now, let's talk about the effects of Islam today, just very quickly as we close. Once again, Islam is making great advance in the world. It's not as powerful as it was years ago, centuries ago, of course, in terms of its dominance, but it is moving, and it is moving rapidly, but it's moving in a very different sort of way. Today, Islam is moving mostly by migration. Europe is being overrun by Muslim refugees. And I would argue that the term refugees is probably a wrong term to use for them. It is probably more likely to say that they are purposely moving into Europe in order to bring their religion with them to that place. So you will hear stories and read news accounts of the problems that the Western European nations are having with the massive amount of Muslims that are coming in. England is an excellent example. There's a massive Muslim push going on. Now, the United States has been shielded from that largely because it's a lot harder to migrate from Europe to the United States. There, you can just walk. Here, you either got a very long swim or you got to take a boat ride. So it takes more effort to get here. But there is still a great advance of Islam taking place. Probably the only thing that is preventing Islam from taking over the world, quite literally, is the fact that it is deeply internally divided. The Shia-Sunni division, and now with the, what's the third group, the Kurds, there's, and I'm not exactly sure what the distinction is on the Kurds and the others, but I'll go look it up. But there's a lot of internal conflict in Islam, which produces some difficulties. I mean, you have Shiite Muslims in some places running the show and Sunni Muslims in other places. It's the difference, for example, between Iraq and Saudi Arabia. Very different groups of Muslims running the show. So it produces significant political conflict. And as long as Muslims are fighting with themselves, it's very hard for them to go out on conquest. But it's those fights between themselves that are producing the refugees and pushing people into Europe. So that's interesting, I think. However, what makes the West such an easy takeover target is that we are at our culturally weakest point in history. We are at a place where, and here's where it comes down to, remember, Islam is a religion as much as it is a political movement. The two are intertwined. So when you have Christianity disappear almost entirely from Europe, you leave a religious vacuum. And guess what comes in to take its place? So the fact that Europe is being overrun by Islam is not because the nations that they're invading are weak themselves militarily, but because they're weak spiritually. Muslims are able to come in and convert people to Islam easily because people are always looking for some sort of answer religiously or spiritually, and so Islam provides some sense of that answer to many. Not to mention the fact that when they come in, they set up communities and even in those communities establish Sharia law and deny the law of the government of the nation they're living in. You can't tell us what to do. So there's tremendous weakness in the West. So I'm not sure, to be honest with you. I wrote this outline and these bullet points back in 2012 when I first did this session. And as I was copying them into this and thinking through them, I was thinking back in those days that Islam could be a serious threat to the culture of the United States. But I don't think that anymore. I think that secularism is by far and away the single largest threat to American culture now. We will throw over the American form of government not to embrace Islam, but to embrace secularism. And so the wokeism that we're seeing taking place even now is the tip of that iceberg sticking out of the water of a people who are abandoning the traditions that they have had in the West, which are built on a Judeo-Christian foundation, throwing them over for a secular worldview. I don't think Islam is the issue. So I don't think America needs to necessarily worry about a Muslim invasion. Again, the Muslims are too busy fighting each other in the Middle East for them to get their armies together and march over here. In fact, I think the reason why China is a much bigger threat to the United States is because China has embraced secularism all the way to the hilt. It's a pagan society, period, end of sentence. And so China is a much bigger threat because we are ripe to be taken over by the very kind of people that we, or the culture we've embraced as a society. And again, I don't think it's going to be military. I don't believe that the conquest of the United States by China will be militarily. I think they'll just buy us. They already own us, pretty much. So it won't be long before they will convert the entirety of the American experiment over to themselves by virtue of purchasing us right out from underneath us. I mean, you probably don't realize just how many billions of dollars of property in the United States have been converted into Chinese hands over the last decade. Massive. Okay, so they're buying us up, quite literally, right out from underneath us. And they see us as weak because we used to have a Judeo-Christian worldview, but we don't anymore. We gave that up across 3 generations of secularism. And so they're exploiting it at this point. I mean, they're sitting over there cheering the fact that we're making ourselves secular because it gives them the chance to own us. So I don't think Islam is the issue. But it was in the 8th century. It was in the 8th century. And so it is this push of the Muslims that will cause the church in the West to move in the direction that it does. So as we continue into the Church of the Middle Ages, you're going to see now that it's going to be pushing things in that direction, where the church is going to go as we move our way into the Holy Roman Empire. All right, I'll open the floor for questions.
Before Muhammad come along, thousands of years, what do you think happened to all the people in the world? There wasn't no Islam then. So they said Islam is the true religion, the only religion.
Mm-hmm.
Where do they think all their precedents?
Well, they believe that their ancestors were a part of that in a pre-Muhammad sense. I'm not sure how they worked that out exactly. I'd have to go and research that. I'm not sure. But I have heard that they sort of look at Islam as having always existed all the way back to Abraham. That it's always been there. That Muhammad's revelations are simply revelations that have been, quote unquote, known all along. He just received them and codified them, but they were always there, quote unquote, all the way back to Abraham. Again, they would probably simply say, look, some faithful man living in the 5th century BC who was living on the Arabian Peninsula was probably a faithful Muslim. He just didn't know it yet. I would guess that would be the answer. It's the only logical one you can come up with.
Not that early. Islam speaking for it made it. Last speaker said, no nation ever becomes Muslim by force.
Correct.
Always by,
It's always by force. Right.
never, we want to be
Right.
Christian, or we
Right.
want to be Muslim.
Right.
Always by force.
It's always by force because Sharia law is implemented inside of the religion. Okay? In the United States, we have a separation of religion and government, but they don't. A Muslim nation like Saudi Arabia is run by Sharia law because it's part of the very essence of the religion. So when they take over a nation, they impose the Sharia law by virtue of the fact that it's Muslim. We're all Muslims, so we believe in Sharia law. So they impose that upon a people. All the people that are there. As I said, the people that were conquered in all these various places were put under Sharia law. They were given certain promises and they had to make their tributes and so forth, but they could continue, quote unquote, to worship their God as they wanted to. Much of that evaporated, however, over time as those Christians were forced into certain situations. I think today what's happening is that there really isn't any centralized Islamic force. You have all these disparate nations, right? You've got the Saudis, and you've got the Iraqis, and you've got the Egyptians, and so forth, and what's that? That's Persian. They're Muslim, but that's Persian, okay? So this is a different sense, and so you have all these different groups, and the difference is that there's no centralized way to build an army and go and march into Europe now. But they don't need to. They have figured out that they can do this in a different way. They can simply overrun the nation by virtue of just showing up at the door, and because all these Western nations feel guilty and live under perpetual guilt, they let them in, which is precisely what we're doing. Just open the border because we're all feeling guilty about the fact that we eat well, and so let's open the border and let everybody in. Yeah, which is where they're coming from. I mean, you have a massive Somali population, for example, in Minneapolis, which is where, what's her name comes from? No, not Talib. Omar, thank you. Where she comes from. And they're just migrated in. They immigrated in. Because we just opened the doors. Doesn't matter. They all settle together, and they develop power. And then they can elect one to Congress. A representative. But again, I don't think that's really the issue for us here. It certainly is for Europe, just by virtue of the geography. It's much more difficult here. Much more difficult here. Plus the fact that we're the third largest nation on the planet. You would have to import a lot of Muslims to make serious changes to us to turn us into a Muslim nation. I mean, how many Muslims would it take to convert 330 million people? Well, let's take 30 million Muslims out of it. Let's say 300 million people. How would you get 300 million people to convert? Pretty hard.
Our corrupt leadership emphasizes with all the stalling they emphasize with it.
Agreed. Agreed. No doubt of that. I don't disagree with that. But again, if you were to project how we're going to go over the next 20 years, I don't see Islam becoming the primary force of change. I see secularism, and particularly the Far East, being our real problem. And that's a financial reality more than it is a religious one. That's another reason, by the way, just as an aside, very quickly. If you have a nation full of people who are irreligious, meaning they don't hold to a religious view, it's harder to get Muslims to get them converted because they're irreligious, okay? The people in Europe are still religious, they just no longer practice their Christianity anymore. They're convertible because they still see a religious component. Plus the fact they got Muslims living next door because the guy that lives next door used to live in Saudi Arabia, but he just walked here and now bought a house and lives here. But that's not, I don't think that's the case here. China's our problem. Very much so. Yes. Depends on who you ask that question. Can the church really take on that role in a nation of this size? Don't know that. But what a postmillennialist would argue is, at this point, that we need to be a voice in this wilderness, preaching about where the true law comes from, that it comes from God. Okay? So we need to preach against the tide of secularism, that we are not just bags of water, but actually created beings in the image of God. We need to have that message. That's what the postmillennials would argue. The theonomists would probably say, depending on your definition of theonomy, but the theonomists would probably say, yes, we need to be that voice in the wilderness and try to convince our neighbors that they need to embrace a morality that comes from the law of God. Whether the church in America particularly can accomplish that, I don't know. Part of the reason I don't think so at this point is because the theonomic view is very much in the minority amongst evangelicals. The vast majority of evangelicals are dispensational. Thus, the vast majority of evangelicals see a strong disconnect between the state and the church, such that they're quite literally waiting for the rapture to take the church out of here before the real trouble begins. So they're not really in a position of attempting to influence society in that sense. So, again, it depends on your eschatological perspective. But there's no doubt, to answer your question more specifically, Jake, there's no doubt in my mind that we need to be the voice in the world that argues for a morality based on the law of God. We need to be the ones that are standing up and saying, look, transgenderism isn't just wrong because it can kill your ability to have children. It's wrong because it's a violation of the very nature of the image of God in man. That's the argument we need to make. I don't think the church can become a militarized organization, nor do I think it needs to. The gates of hell will not prevail against the church. But the church is a message more than it is a military. Well, BLM is based on the same basic secular idea, isn't it? But it does fit this one. I mean, it does fit this Islamic thing, because probably people in those Islamic nations are asking the exact same question you are. What do we do now? Do we raise arms against these people, or do we try to coexist? Mm-hmm. 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 Well, the church is going to have to be that oasis of common sense in a world that doesn't have that anymore, because they long ago shed the idea of a creator and the fact that we're created in the image of God. So whether it was a Muslim or a BLM guy or an Antifa guy or a Chinese dissident or whatever, no matter what it is, we still need to be the ones to stand up with that voice of saying, there's a morality, it's established by God. That, by the way, is what they're going to hate us for. Because all of the lusts of the flesh are based on their denial of that fact. All right, thank you very much for coming out tonight, and Lord willing, we'll come back and continue our discussion of the Middle Ages next week.